Thank you very much, everyone. So this presentation is about our ongoing project, Oversight of the Work of Healthcare Assistants in BC, Protecting Vulnerable Workers and Clients. So we are a law reform agency focusing on older adults. We conduct research and develop reports and education tools about legal and policy issues relating to aging. Because we work in law, I have to give a quick disclaimer. So we are a research agency, and while most people working in our office are lawyers by training, no one in our office practices, and we cannot give legal advice. We can only give legal information, so that is all we can do here today. So our project focuses on healthcare assistants, and as you know, they can be called a variety of names, such as care aides, community health workers, PSWs, or continuing care assistants, among others. Healthcare assistants are not regulated in BC, and they actually aren't regulated in most other jurisdictions as well. So our project is trying to identify possible law and policy reforms that can both protect public safety and address worker vulnerability. We'll be publishing a study paper this fall outlining what the existing regulations and oversight are, what some of the gaps are in the current system, and some options for reform. So the legal basis for the registry is actually in contract law and policy. The Ministry of Health created the registry, and if a health employer receives public funding, then they would have a contract with either the Ministry of Health or the Health Authority. And this contract states that the health employer must verify a healthcare assistant's credentials with the registry before they're hired. Health employers are also contractually obligated to report if they have suspended or fired a healthcare assistant who's alleged to have committed abuse or neglect. For education in BC, we have a provincial curriculum that education programs can choose to follow. And if they do follow the curriculum, they can apply to be an approved program with the registry and be listed on the registry website. If a program becomes on this list, that means that the graduates meet the education requirements to be credentialed in the BC registry. Healthcare assistants who want to work for a publicly funded employer must be credentialed with the registry. To be credentialed, they must have attended a healthcare assistant program and have the requisite skills. And there's a few different types of healthcare assistants and nurses who can apply. The first are healthcare assistants who graduated from an approved BC program. The second are a Canadian nurse, either an LPN, RN, or RPN. The third are nursing students in Canada who've completed a sufficient number of courses. Next are healthcare assistants from other provinces or territories. There are two pathways here for a person to get credentialed. The first is if there's an expedited pathway, if you've completed enough practice hours and have a letter of competency, or they've graduated within the last 2 years and have a clinical instructor competency reference. The other pathway is a competency assessment to see if they have the required skills, and they may have to complete some remedial education before they are allowed to be on the registry. And last are internationally educated healthcare assistants. They would need to show proof of their education, their English language skills, an international credential assessment, a competency assessment, and they may have to complete some remedial education before registration. Now, one of the main goals of the BC registry is to deal with abuse and neglect. So if a report of abuse or neglect by a healthcare assistant is received by the registry, the healthcare assistant would be suspended while the allegations are being investigated. The definition of abuse includes physical, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse or neglect. And the process of what would happen after the report depends on if there's a union grievance or not. If there is no union in place or there is no grievance, if the healthcare assistant was suspended, they would simply return to the registry when they're back at work. If the healthcare assistant was fired by their employer, they can request the registry appoint an investigator who will write a report and make recommendations. In this case, if there's no union, then the registry would pay for that. When the issue is resolved, if the healthcare assistant is reinstated, as is actually quite common, then they would be returned to the registry. Or if they were fired, then they would remain off the registry permanently. The registry can also place conditions on a healthcare assistant before they can be reinstated. If there is a union in place and there's a union grievance, if the grievance is resolved, then either the healthcare assistant is reinstated if they're keeping their job, or they would be removed if they are staying fired. If the matter is resolved through grievance and the healthcare assistant is reinstated, the registry may require reassurance from the employer that the healthcare assistant does not pose a risk to the public before they're returned to the registry. If the grievance is not resolved and the healthcare assistant was fired, the union can request an investigator be appointed to gather information and try to resolve the matter, and the investigator will make some recommendations. In this case, the costs would be split between the union and the employer. If either party does not accept the recommendations of the investigator, then the matter would likely go to arbitration, but it would depend on the details of the collective agreement. We have identified some issues with the BC registry system. This is not a complete list. We're still in the process of writing the paper. So there are likely going to be more added to this list, but this is just some to start with. The first is under home care. Home care has no on-site supervision and limited access to assistance. And there are many safety concerns for both the healthcare assistant and the client in this context. For private facilities, the current registry does not apply to them if they receive no public funding, so this is a major gap. A private facility may require their healthcare assistant to be under the registry just because of their own choice, but then they may not have access to actually check that, and they wouldn't be required to report abuse and neglect, so that is a major gap in the system. For oversight and supervision, healthcare assistants are doing increasingly complex nursing skills. And in long-term care, as we know, there are often few RNs and LPNs to oversee any delegated nursing tasks, especially during the overnight shifts. For standards of practice and ethics, the registry does not set any standards of practice outside of the required education curriculum that a person may have gone through. And the registry does not address any sort of code of ethics outside of not abusing or neglecting a client or patient. For ongoing education, the healthcare assistant registry does not require any, even though this is a stated goal of the registry. The registry simply just lists some available courses, and healthcare assistants don't usually have time to actually do any ongoing education as part of their workday because they're so overloaded. And this is in contrast to other regulated health professions. Most regulated professions are required to do continuing ongoing education to renew their registration each year. For fitness and competence to practice, there's nothing in place to monitor continued competence once a healthcare assistant is credentialed. And there's no way to discipline a healthcare assistant, remove them, or put any sort of conditions on their practice if they are not competent or fit to practice outside of if they abuse or neglect a client. And avoiding removal from the registry, there is a major gap here. If a healthcare assistant quits before they can be suspended or fired, then they would be able to retain their registry status because the employer is only required to report if they are fired or suspended, the healthcare assistant is. We have some anecdotal evidence from the research that shows that employers may negotiate with an employee and say, if you quit, you can keep your registry status to get around that. And there's also been some anecdotal evidence that unions may also facilitate this quitting in order to retain a healthcare assistant's registry status. Because of course, if you lose this and you're off the registry, you can't work in most places as a healthcare assistant again. I'll discuss some healthcare assistant regulation in Alberta, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. In the rest of the Canadian provinces and territories, healthcare assistants are unregulated. Alberta healthcare aides are very similar to BC. They have a provincial curriculum for education programs, and they have a directory that healthcare assistants working in publicly funded settings must be a part of, but like BC, it excludes private. For Ontario PSWs, they do have a program standard for education, and Ontario is currently creating a voluntary oversight authority, but this is not in place yet. PSWs have a voluntary professional association, which has a code of ethics, practice standards, insurance, and they check education credentials, but this is not a creation of government, so it's nothing that's required. This is very similar to how registered clinical counselors function in BC, if you know what their system is like. And lastly is Nova Scotia continuing care assistance. This is the most comprehensive regulation in Canada and really the only formal regulation. Nova Scotia has a curriculum that licensed education institutes must follow. All continuing care assistants must pass a certification exam that is administered through the Department of Seniors in Long-Term Care, and they have to do this before they start to practice. Nova Scotia also has a mandatory registry that all continuing care assistants must be part of, regardless of employment settings. So this includes purely private facilities. And this is the only place where there's legislation to back up the program. This includes the Continuing Care Assistance Registry Act, some regulations, and an entry to practice policy. I'll discuss briefly some options for reforming regulation. This is not recommendations, but these are just the options that exist out there. The study paper is just to kind of explore these options as a starting point. The first would be to expand the current registry model and fill the gaps, such as increasing oversight, making it mandatory for all healthcare assistants, and fixing the loophole where you can resign to keep your registry status. Another option would be creating a new type of registration, certification, or licensing model. This could be similar to what other health professions have. There are a few other things that exist in BC. For example, paramedics in BC have a very comprehensive licensing scheme. There's also something called a certified registrant under the Health Professions Act. The only one that's currently there are certified dental assistants. In this case, a college would set out the rules for education, entry to the profession, standards of practice, codes of conduct, continuing education, and discipline. And certified non-registrants can sit on the board of a college and vote in elections. We could also embed the registry in legislation. For example, early childhood educators, the requirements for education and registration are listed in the Community Care and Assisted Living Act, so there is a regulatory basis for this. The other option is self-regulation. BC is in the process of modernizing our health profession regulation, which makes it an interesting time to look at health profession regulation. One thing the province wants to do is bring in health professions that are not currently regulated or are regulated differently into the Health Profession Act framework altogether to simplify the system and make fewer colleges. Some example of non-regulated professions that they are considering are counselors and social workers, and differently regulated professions would be dental assistants and paramedics. In fact, the dental college is just in the process of amalgamating right now, and so certified dental assistants will likely come under there with more equal status. Healthcare assistants could also be brought within the nursing college. So here's our contact information. We keep a very active social media presence, so please feel free to follow us. And if anyone wants to reach out for this project, we're currently in the process of having some informal conversations with people who have expertise in this area so we can focus our work on the key challenges. Thank you.